The mists of prehistory conceal the earliest stirrings of what would become Celtic religious consciousness, yet through careful examination of material remains, archaeologists have traced the emergence of distinctive spiritual practices to the late Bronze Age, approximately 1200 years before the Common Era. These proto-Celtic communities dwelling in the heart of Europe developed ritual behaviors that would echo through millennia, establishing patterns of sacred deposition, seasonal observance, and otherworldly communication that would define Celtic spirituality long after the last druids had fallen silent. The Hallstatt culture, named for the Austrian salt mining settlement, where archaeologists first identified its distinctive characteristics, represents the earliest phase of what scholars recognize as authentically Celtic civilization. Between 800 and 450 BCE, these communities created elaborate burial complexes that reveal sophisticated beliefs about death, status, and the continuation of identity beyond mortal existence. The cemetery at Hallstatt itself, carved into the mountainside above the ancient salt works, contained over 2,000 graves spanning 5 centuries of continuous use, each interment telling its own story about the evolving relationship between the living and the dead. Within these graves, archaeologists discovered not merely bodies, but entire worlds prepared for the deceased's journey into whatever realm awaited beyond death. Warriors lay surrounded by their weapons, bronze swords deliberately bent to release their spiritual essence, iron spearheads arranged in patterns that suggested ritual significance beyond mere grave goods. The horses that had carried these warriors in life accompanied them in death, their bones revealing they had been killed and buried with careful attention to their placement relative to their masters. Even the bronze vessels that held funeral feasts spoke of beliefs that the dead required sustenance for their otherworldly journey, that death represented transition rather than termination. The practice of ritual deposition in water, which would become one of the most distinctive features of Celtic religious expression, emerged during this Hallstatt period with remarkable consistency across widely separated regions. Lake Hallstatt itself received hundreds of bronze and iron objects over centuries, each piece carefully selected and deliberately cast into the dark waters. These were not discarded items or accidental losses, but valuable possessions removed from circulation through conscious ritual action. Swords, jewelry, tools, and ceremonial vessels descended through the water column to rest on the lakebed, accumulating in deposits that suggest specific locations held particular sacred significance. The transformation from bronze to iron technology coincided with profound changes in Celtic religious expression, as if the mastery of this harder, more difficult metal opened new pathways for understanding the relationship between human craft and divine power. The Latena period, beginning around 450 BCE, witnessed an explosion of artistic creativity that would produce the flowing, intricate style now recognized as quintessentially Celtic. Named for the shallows of Lake Neuchâtel in Switzerland, where thousands of ritual deposits were discovered, Latena culture spread across Europe from Ireland to Anatolia, carrying with it distinctive approaches to sacred expression. The artwork of this period reveals minds that perceived reality through veils of transformation and ambiguity. Animals flowed into abstract patterns that resolved into human faces before dissolving again into pure geometric design. The famous Gundestrup cauldron, though found in a Danish bog, displays this aesthetic sensibility in silver panels depicting deities, warriors, and ritual scenes that seem to shift meaning depending on viewing angle and light. These were not mere decorative choices, but visual representations of a worldview that understood reality as fundamentally fluid, where boundaries between human, animal, and divine existed only as temporary conveniences rather than fixed categories. The Laten site itself provides extraordinary insight into the scale and complexity of Celtic water ritual. Over 2,500 objects were recovered from the lake, including weapons, tools, jewelry, and human remains. Many items showed signs of deliberate damage before deposition: swords bent beyond use, spearheads broken, shields pierced with ritual perforations. This destruction appears to have been essential to the offering process, perhaps releasing the object's spiritual essence for use in the other world, or preventing its return to mundane use. The practice spread across Celtic Europe, from the Thames in Britain to the Saone in Gaul, creating an archaeological signature of religious behavior that transcended tribal and linguistic boundaries. Sacred landscapes structured Celtic religious practice in ways that modern minds, accustomed to buildings dedicated to worship, struggle to fully comprehend. Natural features served as the primary architecture of Celtic spirituality, with springs, groves, hilltops and caves functioning as portals between the visible world and the invisible realms that interpenetrated daily existence. The sanctuary at Gournay-sur-Aronde in northern France exemplifies how Celts modified natural spaces to enhance their sacred properties. A square enclosure defined by ditches and palisades contained a central pit where weapons and animal bones accumulated over 4 centuries of ritual use. This was not a temple in any conventional sense, but a boundary drawn around sacred space, a frame that focused spiritual attention on the intersection between earth and otherworld. The deliberate absence of written religious texts among the Celts, despite their awareness of writing through contact with Mediterranean civilizations, speaks to fundamental differences in how they understood the nature and transmission of sacred knowledge. Caesar reported that druids, the intellectual and spiritual elite of Celtic society, refused to commit their teachings to writing, believing that sacred wisdom required direct transmission from teacher to student through memorization and oral recitation. This choice preserved the living quality of religious knowledge, allowing each generation of druids to breathe new life into ancient wisdom while maintaining essential continuity with ancestral tradition. The educational system that produced druids required extraordinary dedication, with students spending up to 20 years memorizing vast corpuses of myth, lore, genealogy, and ritual procedure. This was not rote learning, but deep internalization of cultural knowledge that shaped consciousness itself. A fully trained druid carried within memory the entire spiritual and legal framework of Celtic society, able to recite lineages reaching back to mythological ancestors, precedents for any legal dispute, proper procedures for every ritual occasion, and the complex calendrical calculations required to synchronize human activity with cosmic rhythms. The structure of Celtic oral tradition reveals sophisticated techniques for preserving accuracy across generations while allowing for creative elaboration within established frameworks. Stories organized around recurring themes and formulaic expressions provided stable scaffolding that could support varying levels of detail and elaboration depending on audience and occasion. Professional storytellers, the Félid of Ireland and Cypherwidian of Wales, underwent training nearly as rigorous as that of druids, mastering not only narrative content but the subtle vocal techniques, timing, and dramatic presence required to hold audiences through nights of storytelling that served simultaneously as entertainment, education, and spiritual instruction. Seasonal festivals punctuated the Celtic year with periods of intensified otherworldly communication, when the boundaries between realms grew thin enough for spirits, deities, and the dead to move more freely among the living. These celebrations, timed to coincide with critical transitions in the agricultural cycle and solar year, provided regular opportunities for communities to gather, renew social bonds, and collectively engage with supernatural powers that influenced their prosperity and survival. 4 major festivals structured this sacred calendar, each associated with specific deities, ritual practices, and otherworldly phenomena that required careful management to ensure beneficial outcomes. Samhain, marking the transition from summer to winter at the beginning of November, opened the Celtic New Year with acknowledgement that darkness preceded light in the cosmic cycle. This was the time when the dead returned to visit their living kin, when supernatural beings walked freely among humans, when the future could be glimpsed through proper divination techniques. Archaeological evidence from hill forts and royal centres reveals large-scale gatherings during this period, with massive cooking pits, evidence of cattle slaughter, and ritual deposits that suggest communities came together for feasts that simultaneously honoured the dead and strengthened social cohesion against winter is approaching challenges. The lighting of bonfires during Samhain served multiple ritual functions that archaeological remains can only partially illuminate. Fire pits at sites like Tara and Navan Fort show evidence of repeated use during late autumn, with layers of ash and charcoal accumulating over centuries of seasonal celebration. These fires would have provided practical warmth and light during gatherings that extended through long November nights, but their significance extended far beyond mere comfort. The extinguishing of all domestic fires and their rekindling from a sacred flame established symbolic renewal, while creating a moment of darkness that acknowledged the cosmic void from which new creation emerged. Imbolc arrived in early February as the first tentative signs of spring's approach became visible in the lengthening days and the beginning of lactation in pregnant ewes. Associated with the goddess Brigid in her role as patron of fertility, healing and craftsmanship, this festival emphasized purification and preparation for the agricultural year ahead. While less archaeologically visible than the great gatherings of Samhain, Imbolc's importance appears in the continuity of sacred sites associated with Brigid, particularly holy wells and springs that retained their significance through Christianization and into modern times. Beltane welcomed summer at the beginning of May with celebrations of fertility and the full flowering of natural abundance. The tradition of driving cattle between twin bonfires for purification and protection left archaeological traces at sites across Celtic territories, with paired fire pits and cattle bone deposits indicating the ritual's widespread practice. This was a time when supernatural forces of growth and reproduction required careful cultivation through proper ritual observation, when the success of crops and herds for the coming year hung in the balance of correct ceremonial performance. Lugnasad in early August honoured the god Lugh with competitions, trading fairs, and celebrations of the harvest's beginning. Named for Lugh's foster mother, Tailtiu in Irish tradition, these gatherings combined religious observation with practical social functions including trial marriages, legal judgments, and commercial exchange. The earthwork amphitheatres at sites like Telltown in Ireland could accommodate thousands of participants, suggesting these festivals served as crucial mechanisms for maintaining social cohesion across tribal boundaries while ensuring divine approval for the harvest season. The careful timing of these festivals according to solar and lunar observations reveals the sophisticated astronomical knowledge that Celtic religious specialists possessed. The ability to predict and prepare for these crucial ritual moments required continuous observation of celestial movements, maintenance of complex calendrical calculations, and coordination across widespread communities to ensure simultaneous celebration. The Coligny calendar, inscribed on bronze tablets in Gaul during the 1st century BCE, demonstrates the mathematical precision underlying Celtic timekeeping, with its careful tracking of lunar months, solar adjustments, and auspicious versus inauspicious days for various activities. The geographic expansion of Celtic peoples across Europe created a complex tapestry of related yet distinct mythological traditions that evolved through centuries of migration, settlement, and cultural exchange. From their probable origins in the alpine regions of Central Europe, Celtic-speaking communities spread westward into Gaul and Britain, southward into Iberia, eastward into the Balkans and Anatolia, and northward into regions that would later become Germany and Denmark. Each territory developed unique characteristics in their religious expression while maintaining recognizable connections to broader Celtic spiritual themes that transcended political and linguistic boundaries. The movement of Celtic peoples was not a single mass migration, but rather a gradual process of expansion, infiltration, and cultural transmission that occurred over centuries. Archaeological evidence reveals that Celtic material culture, distinctive art styles, weapon types, and ritual practices spread through multiple mechanisms including trade, military service, intermarriage, and the adoption of Celtic customs by indigenous populations. This complex process created hybrid cultures that combined Celtic religious concepts with local traditions, producing regional variations that enriched the overall Celtic mythological landscape while maintaining core spiritual principles. In Gaul, the territory that would become modern France, Celtic mythology achieved perhaps its most elaborate expression through the interaction of numerous tribal groups who shared religious concepts while maintaining distinct local traditions. The Gaulish pantheon included deities whose names appear in Roman inscriptions, indigenous Celtic texts, and classical literary sources, revealing a sophisticated polytheistic system that recognized both universal divine principles and highly localized spiritual forces. Archaeological evidence from sanctuaries throughout Gaul demonstrates the material wealth devoted to religious practice, with massive deposits of coins, weapons, jewelry, and ritual objects indicating the central importance of divine relationships in Gaulish society. The god Lo, known as Lugus in Gaulish inscriptions, commanded widespread veneration throughout Celtic Europe, his name appearing in place names from Lugdunum, modern Lion, to Lugavalium, modern Carlisle. This deity of skill and craftsmanship transcended tribal boundaries to become a truly pan-Celtic figure whose worship united diverse communities through shared recognition of divine excellence. Archaeological evidence from Lion, whose ancient name meant Fortress of Lugus, reveals extensive ritual deposits of metalworking tools, weapons, and jewelry that suggest craftsmen regularly offered their finest work to secure the god's favor. The quality of these offerings, many showing extraordinary technical skill, indicates that Lug's worship attracted the most accomplished artisans who understood their craft as a form of divine service. The iconography associated with Lu, preserved in coins, sculptures, and ritual objects, consistently depicts him as a luminous figure radiating solar energy while maintaining connections to multiple spheres of activity. Gaulish coins show a young man with radiating hair that suggests sunbeams carrying a spear and accompanied by ravens that link him to both prophecy and warfare. His festivals, particularly the August celebration that bore his name, brought together communities from across tribal territories for competitions in craftsmanship, athletics, poetry, and law, all domains under his divine patronage. The god's association with high places appears in the number of hilltop sanctuaries dedicated to him, suggesting his role as a celestial deity who mediated between earthly and heavenly realms. Brigid represents another deity whose worship transcended regional boundaries, though her manifestations varied significantly across Celtic territories. Known as Brigantia among the Brigantes of northern Britain, Brigindo in Gaul, and Brigid in Ireland, this goddess embodied creative forces that sustained both practical crafts and spiritual inspiration. The thermal springs at Bath, though later dedicated to Sulis Minerva under Roman influence, show evidence of earlier dedication to a goddess with clear connections to Brigid's healing aspect. Hundreds of curse tablets thrown into the sacred waters reveal continuity of practice across cultural transitions, with petitioners seeking divine intervention in matters ranging from theft to love, demonstrating the goddess's involvement in all aspects of human life. Archaeological excavations at sites associated with Brigid reveal the material culture of her worship included sophisticated metalworking facilities, suggesting her patronage of smithcraft was not merely symbolic, but involved practical support for technological advancement. The presence of medical instruments, anatomical votives, and healing-related inscriptions at her sanctuaries indicates that her healing functions extended beyond spiritual comfort to include practical medical knowledge that her priesthood maintained and transmitted. The perpetual flames maintained at several of her sanctuaries, evidenced by specially constructed fire altars and extensive ash deposits, created permanent connections between earthly and divine realms that required constant human attention to maintain. Cernunnos, the horned god, depicted on the Gundestrup cauldron, and numerous other artifacts, represented divine authority over nature and the wild forces that existed beyond human control. His distinctive antlered form, often shown seated in a cross-legged position suggestive of meditation or shamanic practice, appears in iconography from the 4th century BCE onward across Celtic Europe. The god's association with wealth appears in his frequent depiction, with torques, coins, and cornucopias, suggesting his role in ensuring prosperity through proper relationship with natural forces. His connection to animals, particularly stags, bulls, and serpents, positioned him as master of the hunt and guardian of wild creatures that provided sustenance while remaining fundamentally outside human domestication. The distribution of Cernunnos imagery reveals concentrations in Gaul and Britain, with particular prominence in forested regions where his mediation between civilization and wilderness held special significance. Rock carvings in the Valcamonica Valley show antlered figures that may represent early forms of this deity, suggesting deep antiquity for the horned god concept. The offerings found at sites associated with Cernunnos include antler deposits, many showing signs of careful curation and ritual treatment, animal figurines in bronze and clay, and coins whose placement suggests they were payment for safe passage through wild territories or requests for successful hunts. Regional variations in divine manifestation reflected local environmental and economic conditions while maintaining recognizable connections to pan-Celtic divine concepts. In coastal areas, deities associated with the sea and maritime activities received particular attention, with sanctuaries positioned at prominent headlands, river mouths, and tidal islands. The goddess Nehelenia, worshipped along the North Sea coast, protected seafarers and merchants while maintaining connections to the other world through her association with dogs, psychopomp animals that guided souls between realms. Altars dedicated to her, discovered in the Netherlands, show her with ships, fruit baskets, and loyal hounds, combining maritime fertility and otherworldly symbolism in ways that served the specific needs of coastal communities. The British Isles developed distinctive mythological characteristics through the interaction of Celtic traditions with indigenous pre-Celtic beliefs and the particular environmental conditions of Atlantic archipelagos. The relative isolation of Britain and especially Ireland from continental influences allowed certain archaic features of Celtic mythology to persist while developing unique elaborations that would eventually provide the most complete picture of Celtic mythological thought. The Welsh tradition, preserved in medieval manuscripts but drawing on much older oral sources, maintained sophisticated narratives about divine figures who had evolved into legendary heroes while retaining clear traces of their divine origins. In Wales, the children of Lear and the children of Don represented divine lineages whose conflicts and alliances structured the mythological landscape. These figures, though presented as legendary humans in medieval texts, display supernatural abilities and cosmic significance that reveal their original divine nature. Manawydan, associated with the sea and craftsmanship, demonstrates the Welsh adaptation of the Irish sea god Manannan, showing how deities evolve differently in varying cultural contexts while maintaining essential characteristics. His role in the Mabinogion as a patient, clever figure who defeats enemies through wisdom rather than force, reflects Welsh values that prioritised intellectual over physical solutions to challenges. Irish mythology preserved the most extensive and complex body of Celtic mythological material, largely due to the island's escape from direct Roman conquest and the subsequent efforts of Christian monks to record oral traditions. The Irish conceptualization of divine beings evolved through multiple phases, from the ancient gods of the Tuatha De Danann to their transformation into the fairy folk of later tradition. This evolution preserved authentic Celtic concepts while adapting them to changing religious contexts, creating layered narratives where Christian and pagan elements coexisted in creative tension. The Tuatha De Danann, whose name means people of the goddess Danu, represented the Irish pantheon in its most developed form. These beings arrived in Ireland from 4 northern cities, Fallias, Gorias, Murias, and Findias, bringing magical treasures that would define royal authority and divine power in Irish tradition. The stone of Fal from Fallias cried out when touched by rightful kings, establishing divine validation of political authority. The spear of Lugh from Gorias guaranteed victory in battle, connecting military success to divine favour. The sword of Nuada from Findias allowed no enemy to escape, representing inevitable divine justice. The cauldron of the Dagda from Murias satisfied all who ate from it, embodying divine abundance and hospitality. The concept of the otherworld permeated Celtic cosmology as a parallel dimension that existed alongside and interpenetrated the visible world. This was not a distant heaven or underworld, but an immediate presence accessible through specific locations, times, and states of consciousness. The otherworld contained the dwelling places of deities, the destinations of the dead, and the sources of wisdom, inspiration, and power that influenced human affairs. Its relationship to the mortal world was complex and multifaceted, sometimes appearing as a source of blessing and abundance, other times as a dangerous realm whose inhabitants could harm those who encountered them unprepared. The Cid Mounds of Ireland represented the most concrete manifestation of otherworld geography, with Neolithic passage tombs reinterpreted as dwelling places of divine beings who had withdrawn from the surface world. These monuments, already ancient when Celtic peoples arrived in Ireland, became integrated into mythological narratives that explained their construction and significance. Each Cid housed specific deities or supernatural beings who maintained influence over surrounding territories, creating a sacred landscape where every prominent hill might conceal an entrance to divine realms. The Welsh NWN served similar functions as a supernatural realm accessible through caves, lakes, and burial mounds. Ruled first by Arorn and later associated with Gwyn ap Nudd, Annwn contained both paradisiacal and threatening aspects that reflected the complex relationship between human and divine realms. The first branch of the Mabinogi describes how Pwyll, Prince of Dyfed, exchanged places with Arorn for a year, ruling the otherworld while its king governed in the mortal realm. This story preserves authentic Celtic concepts about the interpenetration of worlds and the possibility of movement between dimensions for those who possessed proper knowledge or divine favour. Access to the otherworld required specific conditions that varied according to tradition and circumstance. Natural features served as permanent portals, with caves, springs, lakes, and certain trees providing regular access for those who knew proper approaches. Temporal gateways opened at specific times, particularly during the 4 major festivals when boundaries between worlds grew thin. States of consciousness achieved through ritual, meditation, poetic inspiration, or proximity to death could also facilitate otherworld contact. The consumption of special foods or drinks, particularly those associated with supernatural beings, might transport humans to divine realms or allow them to perceive normally invisible aspects of reality. The inhabitants of the otherworld included not only deities, but also the spirits of the dead, supernatural beings of various types, and humans, who had been transported there through death, invitation, or accident. These beings possessed different capabilities and intentions toward humans, ranging from beneficial helpers to dangerous predators. The fairy faith that developed in later centuries represented a continuation of otherworld beliefs, with supernatural beings understood as real presences that required proper respect and careful interaction to avoid harmful consequences. The relationship between deities and specific territories created complex networks of divine authority that influenced political and social organization throughout Celtic lands. Every river, mountain, forest, and significant landscape feature potentially housed divine presence that required acknowledgement through proper ritual observation. The goddess of the Seine, Sequana, presided over the river that bore her name, receiving offerings at her sanctuary near the source, where pilgrims sought healing and divine favor. Similar riverine deities protected major waterways throughout Celtic Europe, their names preserved in the rivers themselves as permanent reminders of divine presence in the landscape. The concept of divine sovereignty connected political authority to territorial spirits in ways that made kingship a sacred as well as secular office. The king's ritual marriage to the sovereignty goddess, whether understood literally or symbolically, established his right to rule while creating obligations to maintain the land's prosperity. This relationship appears in numerous Irish tales where potential kings must correctly identify and embrace the sovereignty goddess, often disguised as a hideous hag who transforms into a beautiful woman upon recognition. These narratives preserved ancient concepts about the connection between rightful rule and divine approval, while providing models for understanding political legitimacy. The Irish mythological tradition preserved in medieval manuscripts provides the most comprehensive window into Celtic religious and cultural beliefs, organized into distinct narrative cycles that address different aspects of cosmic order and human experience. The mythological cycle, anchored by the Lebor Gabála Érenn, or Book of the Taking of Ireland, presents a sophisticated pseudo-historical framework that explains the origins of Ireland's supernatural landscape through successive waves of divine and semi-divine invasions. This complex narrative structure served multiple functions, establishing Ireland's place in biblical history while preserving authentic Celtic cosmological concepts about the relationship between divine beings and the physical world. The text begins with Cessair, allegedly Noah's granddaughter, who arrived in Ireland 40 days before the flood, with 50 women and 3 men. While this biblical connection represents medieval Christian interpolation, the underlying narrative preserves older concepts about the primordial feminine nature of the land and the catastrophic floods that periodically renewed the world. The systematic deaths of Cessair's companions, leaving only Fintan mac Bochra to survive by transforming into various animals, establishes the theme of shape-shifting and survival through transformation that permeates Celtic mythology. Fintan's role as the eternal witness who observes all subsequent invasions provides narrative continuity while embodying the Celtic concept of immortal wisdom preserved through metamorphosis. The arrival of the Tuatha Dé Danann represents the cycle's mythological climax, introducing divine beings whose conflicts and relationships would define Ireland's sacred landscape. These figures arrived in dark clouds, though medieval scribes rationalized this as smoke from their burning ships, bringing 4 magical treasures that established the foundations of legitimate authority. Their initial conflict with the Fir Bolg, resolved through the first battle of Mag Tuiread, demonstrated that divine right required military validation, that sovereignty must be won through struggle rather than simply claimed through superior nature. The second battle of Mag Tuiread provides the cycle's most detailed exploration of cosmic conflict between order and chaos. The Tuatha Dé Danann, representing craftsmanship, law, and divine order, faced the Fomorians, embodying primal chaos, destruction, and the untamed forces that threatened civilized existence. This was not simply a military conflict, but a fundamental struggle over the nature of reality itself, with the battle's outcome determining whether Ireland would support human civilization or remain a realm of monstrous forces hostile to organized society. The preparation for this battle reveals sophisticated concepts about divine kingship and physical perfection. Nuada's loss of his hand in the first battle disqualified him from kingship according to the principle that a king must be physically whole, reflecting beliefs that the ruler's body symbolically represented the land's integrity. His replacement by Brez, whose Fomorian heritage made him technically qualified but spiritually unsuitable, demonstrated the dangers of prioritizing legal technicality over spiritual appropriateness. Brez's misrule, characterized by stinginess, oppression, and failure to maintain proper hospitality, established negative examples that defined royal obligations through their violation. The restoration of Nuada through Dian Sesht, Silver Hand, and later Miach as regeneration of flesh reveals complex medical and magical concepts. The conflict between Dian Sesht and his son Miach over healing methods, culminating in the father killing his son out of professional jealousy, explores themes of generational conflict and the dangerous pride that accompanies exceptional skill. The 365 healing herbs that grew from Miach's grave, each curing specific ailments, represented complete medical knowledge that would have made humans immune to disease had Dian Sesht not scattered them in jealous rage, explaining why perfect healing remains beyond human reach. Lug's arrival at the Tuatha De Danaan's assembly demonstrates the Celtic valorization of multiple excellences over single specialization. When challenged to prove his worthiness for admission, Lug claimed mastery of every craft, from smithing to poetry, from warfare to board games. His title, Samil Danach, meaning skilled in all art, established him as the divine embodiment of human potential for excellence across multiple domains. His tactical leadership during the battle, particularly his binding of Bela of the Evil Eye, whose gaze could destroy armies, demonstrated that intelligence and skill could overcome raw, destructive power. The Dagda's role in the battle reveals the complex nature of Celtic divine kingship, combining awesome power with deliberate buffoonery that humanized divine authority. His club that could kill 9 men with one end and resurrect them with the other represented ultimate power over life and death. His cauldron that never emptied embodied the abundance that righteous rule should provide. Yet his enormous appetite, crude humor, and sexual adventures with the Morrigan presented him as an earthy, accessible figure whose divine nature did not separate him from physical pleasures and bodily functions that defined mortal existence. The Morrigan's participation in the battle, as both prophecy and participant, demonstrates the Celtic understanding of war as simultaneously physical and spiritual conflict. Her pre-battle encounter with the Dagda at the river Unius, where their sexual union ensured victory, represents the sacred marriage between sovereignty and the land that legitimized military action. Her prophecy of the battle's outcome established that victory was predetermined by divine will, while human action remained necessary to manifest that destiny. Her appearance on the battlefield as crow, wolf, and cow, each form representing different aspects of war's reality, showed warfare's multiple dimensions that extended beyond simple combat. The Ulster cycle shifts focus from divine conflicts to heroic human actions, though its protagonists display supernatural abilities that reveal their divine heritage or otherworldly connections. The cycle centers on the court of Conchobar mac Nessa at Emain Masha, and particularly on Cú Chulainn, whose exploits establish the paradigm of Celtic heroism that values individual excellence, tragic fate, and the tension between personal honor and social obligation. Cú Chulainn's conception and birth immediately establish his liminal position between human and divine realms. His mother Dagda's impregnation by Lugh during an otherworldly journey, followed by multiple versions of his birth story that medieval scribes struggled to reconcile, demonstrates the complex relationship between divine parentage and heroic identity. His original name, Setanta, and its transformation to Cú Chulainn after killing Culann's hound, reveals how heroes acquire identity through decisive actions that define their relationship to society. The young hero's arrival at Emain Macha and his defeat of the boy troop demonstrates the disruptive potential of exceptional individuals within established social structures. His insistence on challenging 150 trained youths simultaneously, defeating them despite their numerical advantage, established that heroic excellence transcended normal limitations. Yet his subsequent acceptance into their company after proper introductions shows that raw power required social integration to become constructive rather than destructive force. The Rheastrad, or warp spasm, represents Cú Chulainn's most distinctive ability, a battle fury that transformed him into something beyond human comprehension. Medieval descriptions struggle to convey this transformation's horrific nature, describing his body turning inside out, his hair standing like hawthorn spikes with drops of blood at each tip, his mouth stretching to his ears to reveal every tooth, one eye receding into his skull while the other bulged onto his cheek. This was not mere berserker rage, but a fundamental transformation that accessed otherworldly power at the cost of human form, revealing the terrible price of heroic excellence. The Tainbo Quailnga, the cycle's central narrative, explores themes of honor, obligation, and the futility of violence even while celebrating martial prowess. Queen Medb's invasion of Ulster to steal the brown bull of Cooley, motivated by marital competition with her husband Ailill, seems almost absurdly trivial as causation for the massive destruction that follows. Yet the bulls themselves, semi-divine beings whose combat would reshape the landscape, represent sovereignty and cosmic forces whose conflict transcends human motivation. Cú Chulainn, his single-handed defense of Ulster, while its warriors lay stricken by Macha's curse, demonstrates both the hero's supreme excellence and the isolation that such excellence entails. His invocation of single combat rights forced Medb's army to face him one warrior at a time, using legal tradition to neutralize numerical superiority. Each combat became a moral test as well as physical contest, with Cú Chulainn offering easier terms to honorable opponents while showing no mercy to those who violated warrior codes. The hero's confrontation with Ferdiad, his foster brother and closest friend, represents the cycle's emotional climax and the ultimate expression of heroism's tragic dimensions. Their 3-day combat at the ford, fought with different weapons each day while maintaining formal courtesies between rounds, demonstrates warfare's ritual dimensions that elevated killing beyond mere slaughter. Each evening, they shared food and healing herbs, maintaining friendship, even while duty demanded they attempt to kill each other. Ferdiad's death, accomplished only through Cú Chulainn's use of the mysterious Gai Bolga, left the victor mourning over his friend's body, acknowledging that victory and loss were inseparable aspects of heroic achievement. The intervention of supernatural forces throughout the time reveals how otherworldly powers shaped heroic narrative. The Morrigan's repeated appearances to Cú Chulainn, offering love he rejected and hindrance he overcame, established the complex relationship between heroes and deities who tested, challenged, and ultimately validated heroic achievement through opposition. Lugh's appearance to heal his son during the combat's most desperate phase demonstrated that divine heritage provided support in extremity while still requiring heroes to achieve their own victories. The deaths of the boy troop of Ulster, sent against Cú Chulainn, Through Medb's manipulation, despite their youth and training, reveals the cycle's willingness to confront warfare's genuine horror rather than romanticizing violence. These children, some as young as 7, died attempting to prove their valor against an unbeatable opponent, their deaths serving no strategic purpose beyond demonstrating the wasteful futility that accompanied heroic glory. Cú Chulainn's grief over killing these boys, despite their attack on him, shows that heroic excellence did not eliminate moral awareness of violence's cost. The Ulster cycle's treatment of women reveals complex attitudes toward female power and agency. Medb functions simultaneously as villain and sovereign, her invasion unjustified yet her authority legitimate. Her sexuality, expressed through multiple marriages and affairs, represents not moral failing but the sovereign's prerogative to form alliances through intimate relationships. Her daughter, Finneber's distribution among warriors as promised reward for defeating Cú Chulainn, and her death from shame when this becomes known, demonstrates how women became commodities in heroic exchange systems despite their theoretical high status. Deirdre's story, sometimes included in the Ulster cycle, though standing somewhat apart, explores themes of fate, beauty, and the destructive potential of desire. The prophecy at her birth that she would bring destruction to Ulster created a self-fulfilling dynamic where attempts to prevent catastrophe ensured its occurrence. Conchobar's decision to raise her in isolation as his future wife, her love for Nawiz despite this plan, and the tragic consequences of their elopement, demonstrate how individual desire conflicts with social order in ways that neither pure authority nor complete freedom can resolve. The cycle's conclusion with Cú Chulainn's death demonstrates the inevitable fate awaiting those who transcend normal human limitations. His violation of his numerous jessa, those supernatural prohibitions that simultaneously protected and constrained him, occurred through enemies' careful manipulation rather than heroic choice. The 3 crones cooking dog meat who offered him hospitality created an impossible situation where refusing hospitality or eating dog flesh would violate fundamental obligations. His decision to tie himself to a standing stone so he could die upright facing enemies established the heroic ideal of maintaining dignity even in defeat. The Fenian cycle presents a fundamentally different model of heroic organization from the Ulster tales, centered on Fionn mac Cumhail and his warrior band, the Fianna, who operated as professional soldiers, serving the High King while maintaining independence from local political structures. This voluntary association of warriors drawn from throughout Ireland created a meritocratic alternative to the kinship-based obligations that dominated Ulster cycle narratives. The Fianna's existence outside traditional tribal boundaries allowed them to function as a neutral force that could maintain order between competing territories while pursuing adventures that took them beyond the mortal world into supernatural realms. Fionn's acquisition of wisdom through accidentally tasting the salmon of knowledge establishes his unique position as both warrior and sage, combining physical prowess with supernatural insight. The salmon had fed on hazelnuts from the 9 hazel trees surrounding Conla's well, absorbing all knowledge in existence. When young Fionn, then called Daimna, burned his thumb while cooking the fish for his master, the druid Finnegas, and instinctively sucked the burn, he gained access to universal wisdom. Throughout his adventures, this knowledge manifested whenever he placed his thumb in his mouth, providing solutions to otherwise impossible challenges. This origin story establishes the Celtic principle that wisdom often comes through accident or transgression rather than deliberate pursuit, that the boundaries protecting sacred knowledge prove permeable to those destined to receive it. The requirements for joining the Fianna reveal the exceptional standards that distinguish these warriors from ordinary fighting men. Candidates underwent physical trials that pushed human capability to its limits, standing in a waist-deep hole, defending against 9 warriors, throwing spears simultaneously, running through forests, while the entire Fianna pursued them without breaking a single twig or disturbing their elaborately braided hair. Beyond physical prowess, aspirants needed to memorize 12 books of poetry, demonstrate knowledge of legal traditions, and show proficiency in board games that tested strategic thinking. These requirements created warriors who could function as diplomats, judges, and poets, as well as fighters, embodying the Celtic ideal of excellence across multiple domains. The Fianna's seasonal lifestyle reflected their liminal position between civilization and wilderness, spending winters quartered with noble families throughout Ireland while living entirely outdoors from Beltane to Samhain. This alternation between domestic comfort and wild hardship maintained their edge as warriors while preventing them from becoming either soft courtiers or savage outlaws. Their summer activities included hunting expeditions that might last weeks, patrols along Ireland's borders to prevent foreign invasion, and supernatural adventures that took them into otherworldly realms. The detailed knowledge of Ireland's geography displayed in Fenian tales with specific mountains, rivers, and forests named and characterized created a mythological map that connected landscape features to heroic adventures. The story of Diarmuid and Grain illustrates the tragic conflicts that arose when personal desire challenged warrior brotherhood bonds. Graina, betrothed to the aging Fionn, placed a guise of magical compulsion on young Diarmuid to elope with her, creating an impossible choice between loyalty to his leader and obedience to supernatural obligation. Their flight across Ireland, pursued by Fionn and the Fianna, generated place names and local traditions throughout the country as communities claimed connection to this famous chase. The couple's temporary refuges, marked by dolmens still called Beds of Diarmuid and Grain, demonstrate how mythological narratives became embedded in landscape interpretation. Diarmuid's death, engineered by Fionn through manipulation of the hero's geais against hunting boar, reveals the darker aspects of Fionn's character that balance his wisdom and leadership. Though Fionn possessed the power to heal Diarmuid with water carried in his hands, he allowed it to slip through his fingers twice before finally bringing it too late. This moral failure, allowing personal jealousy to override obligation to a faithful follower, demonstrates that even the greatest heroes remained vulnerable to human weakness. The story's inclusion in the cycle, despite its unflattering portrayal of Fionn, suggests that Celtic tradition valued complex characterization over simple hagiography. The supernatural women who appear throughout Fenian tales represent various aspects of otherworldly power that tested and transformed mortal heroes. Sadby, transformed into a deer by the dark druid Fear Dwairsha, could only assume human form within Fionn's fortress on the hill of Allen. Their brief union produced Oisin, greatest of the Fenian poets, who inherited both parents' connections to supernatural realms. Sadb's eventual recapture by Fear Dwairsha, despite Fionn's protection, established that otherworldly powers operated according to their own rules that even the greatest heroes could not always circumvent. The story of Niamh of the Golden Hair, taking Oisin to Tir Nanog, explores the temporal distortions that characterized movement between worlds. Their journey across the sea on Niamh's white horse that ran upon the waves took them to the land of youth where aging ceased and every pleasure was available. Oisin's 3 years there, which proved to be 3 centuries in mortal time, demonstrated the dangerous allure of otherworldly paradise. His return to Ireland to find the Fianna long dead and the heroic age ended represents the irreversible nature of temporal passage and the impossibility of recovering lost golden ages. The historical cycle, also known as the Cycle of the Kings, occupies a unique position between mythology and history, presenting stories of allegedly historical rulers that incorporate clearly supernatural elements. These narratives served political functions by establishing precedents for contemporary kingship, while preserving older mythological material within pseudo-historical frameworks. The cycle's treatment of kingship reveals sophisticated understanding of the relationship between political power and supernatural sanction, with legitimate rule depending on proper relationship with sovereignty goddesses and adherence to cosmic order. The tale of Conaire Mór demonstrates the complex obligations and prohibitions that surrounded sacred kingship. His conception through his mother's union with a birdman established his otherworldly connections, while his recognition as rightful king through a series of prophesied signs validated his authority through divine approval rather than hereditary succession. The numerous jessa that constrained his behavior, prohibitions against traveling certain directions on specific days, requirements to accept hospitality from particular categories of people, and obligations to make specific judgments in legal cases, created an impossible web of restrictions that ultimately ensured his doom. His death at Dagda's hostel, engineered by enemies who deliberately created situations where he had to violate his Gessa, demonstrated that the very sanctity that elevated kings above ordinary mortals also made them vulnerable to supernatural manipulation. The sovereignty goddess appears throughout the historical cycle in various forms, testing potential rulers and validating legitimate authority. The Cailleach Peara, the Hag of Beara, represented sovereignty grown old through centuries of marriage to successive kings, her repeated rejuvenation and aging reflecting the cyclical nature of political power. Her laments for lost youth and departed lovers preserved memories of numerous royal dynasties while establishing the principle that sovereignty transcended individual rulers. The transformation of the hag into a beautiful young woman upon recognition by the rightful king became a standard motif that appeared in tales throughout Ireland and Scotland. Niall of the Nine Hostages exemplifies the historical cycle's blend of verifiable history with mythological elaboration. His recognition as rightful High King through willingness to kiss a hideous hag at a well, who then transformed into a beautiful woman representing sovereignty, provides divine validation for his authority. His epithet, referring to hostages taken from 9 different territories, reflects historical practices of political domination, while his legendary adventures in Britain and continental Europe expand his significance beyond historically plausible dimensions. The attribution of numerous Irish dynasties to Niall's descendants demonstrates how mythological narratives served genealogical functions that validated contemporary political arrangements. The Welsh mythological tradition preserved in the Mabinogion presents narratives of comparable sophistication that explore themes of sovereignty, transformation, and the relationship between mortal and supernatural realms through distinctively Welsh cultural perspectives. The 4 branches of the Mabinogi, comprising the tales of Pwyll, Branwen, Manawydan, and Math, create an interconnected narrative that follows characters across generations while exploring the consequences of supernatural interactions. These stories demonstrate remarkable literary artistry in their construction, with seemingly minor details in early branches proving crucial to understanding later events. The first branch establishes fundamental principles about otherworldly interaction through Pwyll's encounter with Arawn, king of Anwen. Their year-long exchange of identities tested both rulers' honor and demonstrated that true kingship transcended physical presence. Pwyll's restraint in not sleeping with Arawn's wife, despite sharing her bed for a year, established sexual continence as a marker of honor that distinguished noble from base behavior. His successful defeat of Hafgan, Arawn's otherworldly enemy, through following precise instructions about striking only once, demonstrated that supernatural conflicts required discipline and obedience to cosmic laws rather than simple martial prowess. Rhiannon's appearance in the first branch introduces a sovereignty figure whose otherworldly nature manifests through her association with horses and birds. Her initial appearance riding a white horse that no earthly mount could overtake, despite its seemingly leisurely pace, establishes the deceptive nature of otherworldly manifestations. Her three birds, whose song could wake the dead and lull the living to sleep, represent the power of otherworldly music to transcend normal limitations of consciousness. Her patient endurance of unjust punishment, carrying visitors on her back like a horse after being falsely accused of killing her son, demonstrates the sovereignty goddess's willingness to suffer humiliation while awaiting eventual vindication. The second branch, focusing on Branwen, daughter of Lear, explores the catastrophic consequences of failed diplomacy and the escalation of honor conflicts beyond rational resolution. The gigantic Bendigeidfran, whose size required him to wade across the Irish Sea while his fleet sailed alongside, represents divine kingship in its most literally elevated form. His gift of the cauldron of rebirth to the Irish king Matholwch, as compensation for insult, established the circulation of magical objects between realms as a mechanism for maintaining cosmic balance. The cauldron's later use against British forces demonstrated how gifts given in peace could become weapons in war, how the same power that preserved life could perpetuate destruction. The systematic destruction that concludes the second branch, with only 7 British survivors and 5 pregnant Irish women remaining from 2 great hosts, establishes war's ultimate futility even when victory is achieved. Bendigeidfran's severed head, continuing to speak and provide companionship for 80 years, demonstrated that death did not immediately sever connections between beings of supernatural power and the mortal world. The head's eventual burial in London as a protective talisman against invasion preserved the divine king's protective function even after bodily death, though Arthur would later remove it, declaring that Britain should rely on mortal strength rather than magical protection. The third branch presents Manawydan as a figure of patience and craft who resolves supernatural challenges through intelligence rather than force. His response to the enchantment that devastates Dyfed, leaving only 4 survivors in an empty landscape, demonstrates practical adaptation to impossible circumstances. His successive attempts to make a living as farmer, shoemaker, and saddler, each time driven away by local craftsmen jealous of his superior skill, establishes the tension between excellence and social integration that characterize supernatural beings attempting to live in mortal society. His eventual capture of the pregnant mouse, who proves to be the wife of the enchanter, Llwyd, reveals how patience and observation could overcome supernatural opposition that direct confrontation could not defeat. The fourth branch presents the most complex exploration of magic, transformation, and sexual violence in Welsh tradition. Math's requirement that his feet rest in a virgin's lap, except during war, establishes the intimate connection between royal power and sexual purity that pervades the tale. Gwydion and Gylfethwai's rape of the virgin footholder, Gowyn, represents a fundamental violation of cosmic order that requires extraordinary punishment. Their transformation by Math into mating pairs of deer, swine, and wolves, bearing offspring in both male and female forms, explores themes of gender, sexuality, and reproduction that transcend simple moral instruction. The Celtic conception of the otherworld transcended simple notions of an afterlife or divine dwelling place, representing instead a parallel dimension that existed alongside and interpenetrated the visible world at specific locations and times. This realm contained multiple regions with distinct characteristics, from the timeless paradise of Tir na Nog to the more ambiguous spaces beneath lakes and within hollow hills where supernatural beings pursued their own complex existences. Archaeological evidence from across Celtic territories reveals how certain landscape features functioned as recognized portals between worlds, creating a sacred geography that structured both religious practice and social organization. The Sid Mounds of Ireland represent the most extensively documented category of otherworld gateways, with Neolithic passage tombs constructed between 3200 and 2500 BCE, reinterpreted by Celtic peoples as palaces of the Tuatha De Danann. These monuments, already ancient when Celtic culture emerged, became integrated into mythological narratives that explained their construction while establishing their function as interfaces between dimensions. Newgrange, the most famous of these sites, demonstrates sophisticated understanding of astronomical cycles through its winter solstice alignment, when sunlight penetrates the passage to illuminate the inner chamber for 17 minutes, transforming the darkness into a realm of golden light. Archaeological investigation at Newgrange reveals continuous ritual activity spanning 4 millennia, with deposits from the Bronze Age through medieval periods indicating that successive cultures recognized its sacred significance. Roman coins found within the chamber suggest that even foreign visitors acknowledged its supernatural importance, while early Christian crosses carved on the stones demonstrate how the new religion incorporated rather than destroyed these ancient sacred sites. The medieval identification of Newgrange as Brú na Bóinne, the palace of Angus Og, god of love and poetry, preserved authentic traditions about its otherworldly associations while adapting them to contemporary religious understanding. The concept of temporal gateways added another dimension to otherworld access, with specific times when boundaries between realms became permeable enough for movement between dimensions. The 4 major Celtic festivals mark these periods of increased supernatural activity, requiring careful ritual management to ensure beneficial rather than harmful interactions. During Samhain, the Celtic New Year beginning at sunset on October 31st, the veil between worlds grew so thin that the dead could return to visit their living kin, while supernatural beings walked freely among humans. Archaeological evidence from hill fort sites shows intensified ritual activity during this period, with large cooking pits, evidence of cattle slaughter, and unusual deposits, suggesting communities gathered for ceremonies that simultaneously honored the dead and protected the living. The tradition of extinguishing all fires and rekindling them from a sacred flame, established at royal centers, created a moment of absolute darkness that acknowledged the primordial void while asserting human ability to recreate light through proper ritual action. This practice, documented at sites like Dagda in County Meath, required coordination across territories and demonstrated how temporal gateways necessitated collective rather than individual response. The association of divination with Samhain reflected belief that the otherworld's proximity made hidden knowledge accessible, with practices ranging from interpreting apple peel patterns to observing the behavior of animals believed to perceive supernatural presences invisible to human eyes. Beltane, celebrating summer's arrival on May the 1st, opened gateways associated with fertility and growth rather than death and ancestors. The tradition of driving cattle between twin bonfires for purification and protection left archaeological traces at sites throughout Celtic territories, with paired fire pits and cattle bone deposits indicating widespread observance. The gathering of morning dew for its beautifying and healing properties reflected belief that otherworld influences were strongest at liminal moments between night and day. The prohibition against bringing rowan, whitethorn, or elder into houses during Beltane acknowledged that certain plants served as conductors for supernatural forces that might prove dangerous if brought into domestic spaces. Stone circles throughout Celtic territories created permanent sacred enclosures where otherworld communication could occur under controlled conditions. The massive stone circle at Avebury, encompassing 28 acres within its boundaries, represents the largest such monument in Europe. The effort required to transport and erect stones weighing up to 40 tons demonstrates the importance these sites held for Bronze Age and Celtic communities. The circle's internal features, including smaller circles and avenue connections to other monuments, created a complex sacred landscape that structured ritual movement and supernatural interaction. Archaeological evidence from within the Avebury Circle reveals deliberate deposits of human and animal remains, broken pottery and worked flint that indicate continuous ritual use over millennia. The discovery of a child burial at the circle's center, accompanied by a beaker and bone pin, suggests that human sacrifice or the dedication of special individuals might have been required to establish or maintain the site's supernatural connections. The monument's partial destruction during medieval and early modern periods, when stones were broken up for building material, demonstrates how changing religious attitudes transformed sacred sites into resources, though local traditions about the stone's supernatural properties persisted despite official disapproval. Sacred groves represented organic otherworld gateways that required different maintenance than stone monuments. Classical authors described Celtic groves where human sacrifice occurred and where priests alone could enter certain precincts, though these accounts likely exaggerate for dramatic effect. The archaeological site of Gournay-sur-Aronde provides material evidence for grove-centered ritual activity, with a rectangular enclosure containing thousands of weapons and animal bones deposited over 4 centuries. The weapons show deliberate damage before deposition, bent or broken, to kill them ritually and release their spiritual essence for otherworld use. Water boundaries held particular significance as otherworld interfaces with springs, lakes and rivers, serving as both practical resources and supernatural thresholds. The hundreds of skulls discovered in the sanctuary of Roquepertuis in southern France, displayed in niches carved into stone pillars, may represent enemies whose spirits were bound to protect the sacred spring. The tradition of depositing valuable objects in water, documented from Scotland to Slovenia, created archaeological assemblages that reveal both the wealth devoted to supernatural communication and the specific types of objects considered appropriate offerings. The deposit at Lyn Cerrig on Anglesey demonstrates the scale and variety of water offerings, with over 150 iron objects including slave chains, weapons, chariot fittings, and tools deliberately thrown into the lake between 300 BCE and 60 CE. Many items show evidence of ritual damage before deposition, while the presence of animal and possibly human bones suggests that living sacrifices accompanied material offerings. The selection of objects predominantly related to warfare and high-status display indicates that water deposits served specific functions related to military success and social position, rather than general religious observance. Islands combined water boundaries with physical separation to create ideal otherworld locations. The Isle of Man, positioned between Britain and Ireland, developed distinctive traditions that blended influences from both regions while maintaining unique characteristics. The island's association with Manannán mac Lir, the sea god who could envelop it in mist to hide it from enemies, established it as a place where otherworld powers directly influenced physical reality. The tradition that Manannán ruled man from his palace on South Barrule Mountain, where mists still gather with unusual frequency, preserves authentic connections between meteorological phenomena and supernatural interpretation. The concept of Tir na Nog, the land of eternal youth, represented the most idealized vision of the otherworld, where aging ceased, wounds healed immediately, and every pleasure remained perpetually available. Access to this realm typically required supernatural invitation or assistance, with tales describing heroes transported across water on horses that ran upon waves or in boats that sailed without wind. The temporal distortions that characterized visits to Tir na Nog where days might equal centuries in mortal time, warned about the dangers of otherworld seduction while acknowledging its irresistible appeal. Magmel, the Plane of Delight, presented a different otherworld conception focused on sensory pleasure and material abundance rather than temporal suspension. Descriptions of silver trees bearing golden apples, rivers of mead, and palaces built from precious stones created a landscape of impossible wealth that contrasted sharply with the hardships of mortal existence. The location of Magmel beneath the sea or beyond the western horizon connected it to the daily solar cycle and the mystery of where the sun went after setting. Tech Duin, the House of Dawn, represented a darker otherworld conception as the gathering place of the dead before their final journey. Located on a rocky island off Ireland's southwest coast, this realm was ruled by Don, the dark god of the dead who called the deceased to his house. The tradition that souls assembled at Tech Duin before departing for their final destinations preserved pre-Christian concepts about death as a journey requiring preparation and guidance. Archaeological evidence from coastal promontory sites shows ritual deposits and possible funeral pyres that may represent ceremonies connected to this belief system. The Welsh otherworld of Ann WN encompassed multiple regions with varying characteristics, from the paradise ruled by Arawn to darker realms associated with Gwyn ap y Nudd and the Wild Hunt. The tradition of Cwen Anndabion, the hounds of Annwn whose howling foretold death, created acoustic gateways where sound rather than sight provided otherworld contact. These spectral hounds, described as white with red ears, reversed normal coloration in ways that marked their supernatural nature. Their howls grew quieter as they approached, defying natural acoustic laws and demonstrating how otherworld phenomena operated according to different physical principles. Sacred kingship functioned as a living gateway between mortal and otherworld realms, with the king serving as the primary intermediary between his people and supernatural forces. This role required more than political authority or military prowess, demanding instead a sacred marriage with the sovereignty goddess who embodied the land's spiritual essence. Archaeological evidence from royal sites throughout Celtic territories reveals the material culture associated with this sacred relationship, including ritual deposits, ceremonial structures, and iconographic representations that demonstrate the intersection of political and religious authority. The inauguration ceremonies that established sacred kingship involved complex rituals that validated the ruler's fitness through supernatural approval. At Tara, the Lia Fail, or Stone of Destiny, would cry out when touched by the rightful High King of Ireland, providing divine confirmation that transcended human political processes. The stone's voice, audible to all present, eliminated ambiguity about legitimate succession while establishing the new king's connection to otherworldly authority. Archaeological investigation at Tara reveals multiple phases of monument construction over 3 millennia, indicating the site's enduring significance as a place where supernatural and political power converged. The Gesa, or ritual prohibitions that bound Celtic kings, created networks of supernatural obligation that simultaneously empowered and constrained royal authority. These prohibitions, often seemingly arbitrary, such as not travelling clockwise around certain territories or not refusing hospitality from red-haired women, created vulnerabilities that enemies could exploit. Yet they also demonstrated the king's submission to cosmic order, acknowledging that royal power derived from supernatural sanction rather than personal strength. The violation of Gesa, whether deliberate or accidental, inevitably led to the king's downfall, establishing that even the most powerful rulers remained subject to otherworldly authority. The relationship between the king and the land's fertility appeared in numerous traditions that connected royal behavior to agricultural success. The righteous king's reign brought favorable weather, abundant harvests, and healthy livestock, while the unjust ruler's presence caused crops to fail, cattle to sicken, and springs to dry up. This connection was understood as direct rather than symbolic, with the king's moral and physical condition immediately affecting the territory's prosperity. Archaeological evidence from royal sites shows large-scale grain storage facilities and redistribution centers that suggest kings managed agricultural surpluses as part of their sacred obligations. The Celtic conception of heroism transcended mere physical prowess to encompass a complex synthesis of supernatural ability, moral obligation, and tragic inevitability that elevated warriors beyond ordinary human achievement while simultaneously binding them to fates that often proved catastrophic. Archaeological evidence from warrior burials across Celtic territories reveals the material culture that supported these heroic ideals through elaborate grave goods, specialized weapons, and ritual deposits that demonstrate the elevated status accorded to exceptional fighters. These warriors operated within frameworks of sacred duties and mystical constraints that made their victories meaningful beyond simple military success, while ensuring their eventual downfall through the very excellences that defined them. The supernatural abilities that distinguished Celtic heroes from ordinary warriors manifested in various forms that connected individual prowess to otherworldly power. The Rheastrad, or battle fury, that transformed warriors into terrifying engines of destruction represented the most dramatic of these abilities, though archaeological evidence suggests this phenomenon had basis in actual warrior practices. Excavations at sites like Danebury and Maiden Castle have revealed human remains bearing wounds that indicate frenzied combat beyond normal military engagement, with multiple strikes delivered after death and evidence of dismemberment that suggests ritualized violence extending beyond practical necessity. The weapons associated with heroic combat often possessed supernatural properties that enhanced their wielders' abilities while creating dependencies that proved ultimately destructive. The Guy Bolger of Cú Chulainn, described as creating 30 wounds from a single thrust, may represent a category of specialized weapons that archaeological finds partially illuminate. Complex multi-barbed spearheads discovered at Latene sites show sophisticated metallurgy that created weapons of exceptional lethality, though whether these possessed the magical properties attributed to legendary weapons remains beyond archaeological verification. The practice of ritually damaging weapons before deposition, documented at hundreds of sites, suggests beliefs about the spiritual essence of weapons that required special treatment to prevent their supernatural power from being misused. The concept of geas, those supernatural prohibitions and obligations that bound heroes, created a complex web of constraints that simultaneously protected and endangered those subject to them. These ritual obligations took various forms, from dietary restrictions to behavioral requirements, each violation bringing the hero closer to inevitable doom. The impossibility of maintaining all Jessa indefinitely meant that heroic careers contained their own termination conditions, making tragedy an inherent rather than accidental aspect of heroic narrative. This acceptance of inevitable downfall distinguished Celtic heroism from traditions that emphasized unlimited victory, acknowledging that even supernatural abilities could not overcome cosmic necessity. Female warriors occupied distinctive positions within Celtic heroic tradition, combining martial prowess with supernatural authority in ways that challenged conventional gender boundaries while maintaining their own distinct characteristics. Scarthach, the warrior woman who trained heroes on her island fortress, represented female martial excellence that exceeded male achievement. Her school on the Isle of Skye, accessible only by crossing a bridge that would throw back unworthy candidates, established women as ultimate authorities on combat excellence. The archaeological evidence for female warrior burials, including the Vix burial, with its combination of weapons and feminine grave goods, suggests that some women did achieve warrior status, though the extent and nature of female military participation remains debated. The training methods Scarthash employed went beyond conventional weapons instruction to include supernatural techniques that transformed students into heroes capable of transcending normal human limitations. The salmon leap, allowing warriors to jump impossible distances, the hero's light that emanated from exceptional fighters during combat, and the ability to fight while balanced on spear points or rope, represented abilities that separated heroes from ordinary fighters. These techniques, while fantastical in description, may preserve memories of actual martial arts training that emphasized agility, balance, and psychological preparation for combat. The emphasis on combining physical training with poetic composition and legal knowledge created warriors who could function as complete social beings rather than mere fighting machines. Queen Medb of Connaught embodied a different model of female power that combined political authority, military leadership, and sexual sovereignty in ways that both utilized and transcended conventional gender roles. Her initiation of the Tainn Bo Cuailnge through bedroom conversation about relative wealth demonstrated how intimate relationships could generate political and military consequences. Her ability to promise her daughter Finnabair to multiple warriors simultaneously, using sexual promise as military motivation, showed pragmatic manipulation of gender expectations for strategic advantage. Archaeological evidence from Rathcrogan, Medby's legendary capital, reveals a complex of monuments and earthworks that indicate the site as importance as a political and ceremonial centre, though direct connection to the historical or mythological Medb remains speculative. The Morrigan represented the most complex intersection of warfare, sovereignty, and supernatural power in Celtic tradition. Her triple nature, appearing sometimes as three distinct sisters and sometimes as one being with multiple aspects, embodied war's different dimensions, from the fury of battle to the aftermath of carrion birds feeding on corpses. Her ability to influence battle outcomes through prophecy, shape-shifting, and direct intervention established her as more than a war deity, functioning instead as the supernatural arbiter of legitimate violence. The prevalence of crow and raven remains at Celtic warrior burial sites may reflect rituals connected to the Morrigan's corvid associations, though distinguishing deliberate deposition from natural accumulation remains challenging. Warrior bands like the Fianna represented institutional frameworks for heroic activity that provided structure and meaning for exceptional fighters while maintaining their separation from ordinary society. These organizations operated according to their own rules and hierarchies, creating alternative social structures that valued individual excellence while demanding absolute loyalty to the group. The archaeological evidence for specialized warrior equipment, including distinctive sword types and decorative elements that may have indicated membership in elite fighting units, suggests that such groups had material as well as literary existence. The seasonal alternation between settled and wild existence that characterized the Fianna's lifestyle reflected broader Celtic concepts about the relationship between civilization and nature. During winter months, warriors integrated into settled society, participating in feasts, legal proceedings, and social relationships that maintained their connections to the communities they protected. During summer months, they lived entirely outdoors, hunting, patrolling borders, and engaging in adventures that took them beyond normal human experience. This cyclical movement between domestic and wild spaces prevented warriors from becoming either completely civilized or entirely savage, maintaining the liminal status that enabled them to mediate between human society and supernatural threats. The druids occupied the apex of Celtic intellectual and spiritual hierarchy, serving simultaneously as priests, judges, healers, teachers, and intermediaries between human and divine realms. Their 20-year educational program created individuals who embodied their society's complete cultural knowledge, from practical medical treatments to cosmic theological principles. Archaeological evidence from sites associated with druidical activity, including the sanctuary at Anglesey and various Nemerton or sacred groves throughout Gaul, reveals the material culture of their practice through specialized ritual deposits, astronomical alignments, and evidence of complex ceremonial procedures. The prohibition against writing sacred knowledge that characterized druidical tradition reflected fundamental beliefs about the nature of wisdom and its proper transmission. Knowledge passed orally from teacher to student remained living wisdom, capable of adaptation and growth while maintaining essential continuity. Written knowledge became fixed and dead, losing the vital force that made it spiritually effective. This principle extended beyond mere tradition to encompass beliefs about the relationship between consciousness, memory, and spiritual power. The druid who carried thousands of verses in memory possessed those verses in a way that no reader of books ever could, making memory itself a form of spiritual practice. The mnemonic techniques druids employed to maintain vast stores of information reveal sophisticated understanding of human consciousness and its capabilities. The use of triadic formulations, where concepts were organized in groups of three, created stable structures that aided recall while reflecting cosmic principles about the sacred nature of triple forms. The practice of associating specific information with geographic locations, creating mental landscapes where knowledge could be stored and retrieved, anticipated memory palace techniques by centuries. The rhythmic patterns of oral recitation, preserved partially in surviving Celtic poetry, created acoustic frameworks that made accurate transmission possible across generations. The legal functions druids performed extended beyond simple arbitration to encompass the maintenance of cosmic order through proper application of traditional law. Celtic law, as preserved in Irish texts like the Senchus Mór, reveals a sophisticated system of compensations and obligations that connected individual actions to communal consequences. The druids' role in maintaining genealogies enabled them to determine proper relationships between individuals, establishing who could marry whom, who inherited what property, and who owed obligations to whom. Their ability to impose or lift curses gave them enforcement power that transcended physical coercion, making their legal judgments effective through supernatural as well as social sanction. The medical knowledge druids possessed combined practical understanding of herbs and treatments with supernatural healing techniques that addressed spiritual as well as physical ailments. Archaeological evidence from sites like the thermal springs at Bath reveals the integration of natural healing properties with religious ritual, as pilgrims sought cures through both mineral waters and divine intervention. The anatomical ex-votos found at healing sanctuaries throughout Celtic territories demonstrate sophisticated understanding of internal anatomy, while the prevalence of trephinated skulls that show healing indicates successful surgical interventions. The astronomical knowledge required for druidical functions extended beyond simple calendar keeping to encompass complex calculations about cosmic cycles and their terrestrial effects. The Coligny calendar demonstrates mathematical sophistication in reconciling lunar and solar cycles, while monument alignments throughout Celtic territories show precise understanding of celestial movements. The ability to predict eclipses, determine auspicious timing for various activities, and coordinate festivals across widespread territories required continuous observation and calculation that made druids indispensable to social functioning. The educational methods druids employed created not just learned individuals, but transformed consciousness itself. Students underwent sensory deprivation, lying in dark rooms composing poetry that emerged from inner rather than outer vision. They practiced forms of meditation that involved focusing on single sounds or images for extended periods, developing concentration that enabled them to maintain attention through night-long recitations. These practices, similar to techniques found in other Indo-European traditions, suggest common origins for spiritual technologies that used consciousness itself as the primary tool for accessing divine knowledge. The relationship between druids and political authority created complex dynamics that influenced Celtic governance throughout the pre-Roman period. Kings required druidical validation for their authority, as druids possessed the genealogical knowledge that could establish or challenge claims to legitimate rule. The druids' ability to impose jessa created constraints on royal behavior that prevented tyranny while potentially paralyzing leadership through excessive restriction. Archaeological evidence from royal sites shows consistent association between political and religious structures, with temples and sacred enclosures positioned near royal halls, indicating the inseparable nature of political and religious authority. The role of the Philid or professional poets represented a parallel tradition that preserved mythological knowledge through artistic rather than religious frameworks. These poets, who underwent training nearly as extensive as druids, maintained cultural memory through narratives that entertained while instructing. Their ability to compose praise poems that enhanced reputation, or satires that destroyed standing, made them powerful social forces whose influence extended throughout Celtic society. The tradition that a king whom poets refused to praise would lose his sovereignty demonstrates the practical power that cultural memory holders exercised over political authority. The arrival of Christianity in Celtic territories initiated a complex process of cultural transformation that would reshape religious practice while preserving substantial elements of pre-Christian tradition through adaptation and reinterpretation. Unlike the Roman conquest, which sought to suppress Celtic religion through military force and legal prohibition, Christian missionaries employed sophisticated strategies that recognized the deep roots of indigenous belief and sought to redirect rather than eliminate sacred energies. Archaeological evidence from early Christian sites throughout Ireland, Scotland, Wales, and Brittany reveals material traces of this religious transition through hybrid iconography, repurposed sacred locations, and burial practices that blended Christian and Celtic elements. The process began at different times across Celtic territories, with Christianity reaching Roman Britain by the 2nd century, while Ireland remained predominantly pagan until the 5th century. This temporal variation created different patterns of conversion that reflected local political structures and cultural conditions. In Romanized areas of Britain and Gaul, Christianity initially spread through urban centers and military networks, creating Latin-speaking Christian communities that maintained distance from rural Celtic traditions. In Ireland and Scotland, where Roman influence remained minimal, Christianity encountered Celtic culture directly, necessitating different evangelical approaches that engaged with indigenous beliefs rather than simply replacing them. Patrick's mission to Ireland, traditionally dated to 432 CE, though probably beginning earlier, exemplified the adaptive strategies that successful missionaries employed. His own writings reveal sophisticated understanding of Irish social structures and religious psychology. Rather than condemning Druidism outright, he demonstrated Christianity's superior power through public confrontations that employed familiar Celtic concepts of spiritual competition. The famous story of his lighting the Easter fire on the Hill of Slane before the Druids could kindle their Beltane flames represented not destruction of traditional practice, but its redirection toward Christian purposes. The fire remained, its timing and meaning transformed, but its essential function as marker of seasonal transition preserved. Archaeological evidence from sites associated with Patrick's mission reveals gradual rather than sudden transformation. At Armagh, his primary ecclesiastical foundation, excavations show continuous occupation from the Iron Age through medieval periods, with pagan ritual deposits gradually giving way to Christian burials and architectural features. The orientation of early churches at the site respects earlier sacred alignments, while introducing new elements like Eastern orientation that reflected Christian cosmology. This layering of sacred significance created palimpsests where multiple religious meanings coexisted in single locations. The conversion of sacred sites represented one of the most visible aspects of religious transformation. Holy wells, springs that had served Celtic communities for healing and divination for centuries, were rededicated to Christian saints while maintaining their essential functions. The Well of St. Brigid at Kildare, clearly associated with the goddess Brigid before Christianization, continued to attract pilgrims seeking healing and fertility blessings. The preservation of traditional practices like leaving cloth offerings tied to nearby trees, walking sunrise around the well, and taking water for domestic protection demonstrates remarkable continuity despite theological transformation. The transformation of seasonal festivals required careful calibration to preserve popular participation while redirecting spiritual focus. Samhain's evolution into All Saints' Day and All Souls' Day maintained the festival's essential function as a time for commemorating the dead, while placing it within Christian theological frameworks. The lighting of bonfires, preparation of special foods, and visiting of graves continued as Christian customs that preserved pre-Christian practices while attributing new meanings to familiar actions. Archaeological evidence from early medieval cemeteries shows increased ritual activity during early November, indicating that communities maintained traditional observances while adapting to Christian requirements. The process of transforming Celtic deities into Christian saints required sophisticated theological maneuvering that preserved divine functions while conforming to monotheistic doctrine. Brigid's transformation from triple goddess to abbess of Kildare represents the most complete example of this process. The saint's traditional biography preserves numerous elements clearly derived from the goddess's mythology, including her birth at threshold between night and day, her association with dairy production and brewing, and her miraculous ability to multiply food and transform water into beer. The perpetual fire maintained at Kildare Monastery, tended by 19 nuns with the saint herself supposedly taking the 20th night, directly continued pre-Christian practices while attributing them to Christian devotion. Archaeological investigation at Kildare reveals continuous sacred use from the Iron Age through medieval periods. Pre-Christian votive deposits gradually gave way to Christian burials and architectural features, but the site's essential sanctity persisted across religious transitions. The discovery of metalworking debris throughout occupation layers demonstrates continuity in craft production that the goddess and later the saint both patronized. The preservation of an ancient oak tree within the monastic enclosure, from which Kildare derives its name, meaning Church of the Oak, shows how Christian institutions incorporated natural features that held pre-Christian significance. The development of Irish monasticism created unique institutions that preserved Celtic learning within Christian frameworks. Unlike continental monasticism that emphasized separation from secular society, Irish monasteries functioned as centers of education, craft production, and cultural preservation that maintained connections to surrounding communities. The curriculum at monastic schools included not only Latin and biblical studies, but also Irish law, poetry, and genealogy that perpetuated traditional knowledge. This synthesis created learned monks who could navigate both Christian and Celtic cultural systems, serving as bridges between old and new traditions. The role of monastic scribes in preserving Celtic mythology represents one of the most significant cultural achievements of the early medieval period. These literate Christians, trained in both native and Latin traditions, possessed the skills necessary to transform oral narratives into written texts while managing the theological challenges this transformation entailed. Their manuscripts, including the Book of Leinster, the Book of the Dun Cow, and the Yellow Book of Lecan, preserve mythological material that would otherwise have vanished with the decline of oral tradition. The techniques they employed reveal sophisticated understanding of both preservation and adaptation requirements. The scribes' treatment of supernatural elements demonstrates nuanced approaches to problematic content. Rather than eliminating magical elements, they recontextualized them within frameworks that distinguished between divine miracles, demonic deceptions, and natural wonders. Druids became poets and judges whose power derived from learning rather than paganism. Shape-shifting could be explained as divine punishment, demonic illusion, or poetic metaphor, depending on context. The otherworld transformed into foreign lands, ancient history, or allegorical representation while maintaining its essential narrative functions. The addition of Christian moral frameworks to pagan narratives created layers of meaning that served different audiences simultaneously. Surface readings provided Christian instruction about virtue and vice, while deeper engagement revealed preserved pagan cosmology and mythology. The story of Etain's multiple transformations, recorded in the Book of the Dun Cow, presents Christian themes of suffering and redemption while preserving Celtic concepts of rebirth and shape-shifting. The narrative's complex structure, with multiple temporal frames and reality levels, demonstrates scribal ability to maintain story integrity while adding interpretive overlays. The preservation of legal traditions required extensive modification to accommodate Christian principles while maintaining functional legal systems. The Brehon laws, transmitted orally for centuries, were written down and modified during the 7th and 8th centuries to incorporate Christian concepts of sin, penance, and charity. The resulting texts preserve remarkable information about pre-Christian social organization, while demonstrating how traditional and imported systems could be synthesized. Archaeological evidence from ring forts and other settlement sites confirms many social patterns described in these laws, validating their historical value despite Christian editing. The transformation of kingship concepts under Christian influence created new models of royal authority that combined traditional sovereignty with biblical kingship. The king's ritual marriage to the sovereignty goddess was replaced by coronation ceremonies that emphasized divine appointment through Christian sacrament. Yet the fundamental connection between righteous rule and territorial prosperity persisted, with chronicles attributing natural disasters and military defeats to royal sins rather than ritual violations. The preservation of inaugural sites like the Stone of Scone and the Hill of Tara, despite their pagan associations, demonstrates how Christianity accommodated rather than eliminated traditional power structures. The development of distinctive insular art styles revealed creative synthesis between Celtic and Christian artistic traditions. The illuminated manuscripts produced in Irish and Scottish scriptoria combined traditional Celtic interlace patterns with Christian iconography to create unique visual languages. The Book of Kells represents the culmination of this synthesis, with its spiral patterns, zoomorphic designs, and abstract decorations that transform biblical text into visual meditation. The sophistication of these manuscripts' production, requiring specialized materials, tools, and expertise, indicates substantial institutional investment in cultural synthesis. High crosses erected throughout Ireland and Scotland during the 8th through 10th centuries demonstrate successful integration of Celtic and Christian symbolic systems. These monuments combined the Christian cross with indigenous traditions of stone carving and public monument construction. Their iconographic programs included biblical scenes executed in styles that reflected Celtic artistic sensibilities, while their placement at monastic sites, crossroads, and traditional assembly places maintained Celtic concepts of sacred geography. The cross's survival despite centuries of religious change indicates their successful integration of multiple meaning systems that resonated across cultural boundaries. The systematic documentation of Celtic mythology by 19th century scholars transformed oral traditions and manuscript fragments into accessible written collections that would reshape European understanding of its pre-Christian heritage. This scholarly revolution began with antiquarian interests in national origins, but evolved into rigorous philological study that established Celtic studies as a legitimate academic discipline. Lady Charlotte Guest's translation of the Mabinogion, published between 1838 and 1849, brought Welsh mythological narratives to English-speaking audiences for the first time, creating foundations for both scholarly analysis and popular appreciation of Celtic literary traditions. Guest worked from manuscripts in the Red Book of Hergest and the White Book of Rhydderch, medieval compilations that had preserved oral narratives through centuries of transmission. Her translation methodology revealed both opportunities and challenges inherent in presenting ancient Celtic material to modern readers. She chose to render medieval Welsh prose into flowing Victorian English that would appeal to contemporary literary tastes while maintaining narrative integrity. Her extensive footnotes provided cultural context, explained unfamiliar concepts, and traced connections between different manuscript versions. This scholarly apparatus established standards for subsequent Celtic translations, while demonstrating that these narratives deserved serious intellectual attention rather than dismissal as primitive folklore. The impact of Guest's work extended far beyond academic circles, influencing Victorian literature, art, and cultural consciousness. Alfred Tennyson drew upon her translations for Arthurian poetry that reached mass audiences, transforming obscure Welsh narratives into foundational texts of English literature. The pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood found inspiration for paintings that depicted otherworldly landscapes and supernatural encounters with unprecedented visual sophistication. William Morris and Edward Burne-Jones created tapestries and stained glass windows based on Mabinogion stories, bringing Celtic mythology into churches and homes throughout Britain. This cultural penetration established Celtic themes as legitimate subjects for high art, while popularizing mythological narratives among audiences who would never read scholarly texts. Parallel developments in Irish scholarship produced equally significant results through systematic examination of manuscript sources and archaeological sites. Eugene O'Curry's Lectures on the Manuscript Materials of Ancient Irish History, delivered at the Catholic University of Dublin during the 1850s, provided comprehensive overview of Irish mythological cycles for academic audiences. His analysis established distinctions between the Ulster cycle, Fenian cycle, and mythological cycle that continue to structure Irish mythological studies. His detailed examination of manuscript traditions, comparing variants and tracing transmission patterns, demonstrated the sophisticated literary achievement these oral traditions represented. John O'Donovan's contributions to Irish scholarship combined philological rigor with geographical investigation that grounded mythological narratives in physical landscapes. His work with the Ordnance Survey of Ireland during the 1830s and 1840s documented thousands of place names with associated mythological traditions. This systematic recording preserved local knowledge that might otherwise have vanished through Anglicization and modernization. His discovery that mythological events could often be traced to specific geographical features validated traditional narratives as historical sources while demonstrating how mythology and landscape intertwined in Celtic consciousness. The German philological tradition brought comparative linguistic methods to Celtic studies that revealed connections between Celtic and other Indo-European mythologies. Johann Caspar Zeus's Grammatica Celtica, published in 1853, established scientific study of Celtic languages by demonstrating their systematic relationships to Sanskrit, Greek, and Latin. This linguistic evidence proved that Celtic mythology belonged to broader Indo-European traditions while maintaining distinctive characteristics. Rudolf Thurnison's subsequent work on Old Irish grammar and metrics enabled more precise translation and interpretation of early texts, revealing layers of meaning that previous scholars had missed through inadequate linguistic understanding. The Celtic revival movement that emerged in the late 19th century transformed scholarly interest into broader cultural phenomenon that influenced literature, politics, and national identity throughout Celtic territories. This movement went beyond academic study to advocate for living Celtic languages, traditional arts, and political autonomy. The revival's emphasis on authentic Celtic culture as alternative to industrial modernity attracted artists and intellectuals who saw in ancient traditions resources for spiritual and cultural renewal. The Irish literary revival, spearheaded by William Butler Yeats, Lady Augusta Gregory, and John Millington Synge, demonstrated creative potential of Celtic mythological material for contemporary literature. Yeats's early poetry transformed ancient heroes and supernatural beings into symbols of Irish national identity and spiritual aspiration. His poem, The Wanderings of Oisin, published in 1889, retold the Fenian hero's journey to the otherworld using language that combined mythological authenticity with symbolist poetic techniques. This work established Yeats as a major literary figure, while proving that Celtic mythology could inspire modernist literature rather than merely antiquarian interest. Lady Gregory's contributions to the revival went beyond translation to include active collection and retelling of Irish folklore. Her books, Cú Chulainn of Muirthemne and Gods and Fighting Men, presented the Ulster and Fenian cycles in prose that preserved essential narrative elements while making them accessible to contemporary readers. Her collaboration with Yeats in founding the Abbey Theatre created institutional framework for dramatic works based on Celtic mythology. The theatre's productions, including Yeats's On Bale's Strand and The Only Jealousy of Emer, brought mythological narratives to popular audiences while establishing distinctively Irish theatrical tradition. The political dimensions of the Celtic revival became increasingly prominent as mythology was employed to construct narratives of national identity, supporting independence movements. In Ireland, mythological cycles provided models of heroic resistance that resonated with contemporary anti-colonial struggles. Cú Chulainn, defending Ulster single-handedly, became symbol of Irish determination against overwhelming odds. The Fianna's role as protectors of Ireland from foreign invasion offered precedent for military resistance to British rule. These mythological parallels provided emotional and cultural resources for political movements, while establishing continuity between ancient and modern struggles. The 1916 Easter Rising explicitly invoked Celtic mythological themes, with leaders like Patrick Pearse drawing parallels between contemporary sacrifice and ancient heroism. Pearse's writings frequently reference Cú Chulainn and the Fianna as models for Irish republicans. The proclamation of the Irish Republic echoed mythological language about sovereignty and the mystical connection between land and people. The Rising's aftermath, with executed leaders becoming martyred heroes, followed patterns established in mythological narratives about heroic sacrifice ensuring eventual victory. Welsh revival efforts focused on preserving and promoting Welsh language and literature as vehicles for national identity. The establishment of the National Eisteddfod as a competitive festival for Welsh poetry and music created institutional framework for maintaining bardic traditions in modern contexts. Scholars like John Morris Jones worked to standardize Welsh orthography and grammar while recovering medieval poetic metres for contemporary use. These efforts ensured that Welsh mythological traditions remained accessible to Welsh speakers while adapting to modern cultural conditions. Scottish Gaelic revival took different forms depending on regional contexts. In the Highlands, collection and publication of Gaelic folklore preserved oral traditions that had maintained Celtic mythological elements despite centuries of suppression. Alexander Carmichael's Carmina Gadelica, published between 1900 and 1971, documented prayers, charms, and traditions that revealed persistence of pre-Christian beliefs within Highland Gaelic culture. The work demonstrated how Celtic mythology survived through adaptation to Christian contexts while maintaining essential characteristics. The romanticization of Highland culture that emerged during the 19th century, though historically problematic in many respects, created popular interest in Celtic traditions that supported revival efforts. The novels of Sir Walter Scott, while taking significant liberties with historical accuracy, popularized Highland themes that influenced Scottish self-perception and international reputation. The revival of Highland games, clan gatherings, and traditional music created contexts for expressing Scottish Celtic identity while adapting ancient traditions to modern circumstances. Modern neo-pagan movements emerging in the 20th century represented more radical attempts to reconstruct Celtic religious practices based on mythological sources and archaeological evidence. These movements sought to create functional religious systems serving contemporary spiritual needs while maintaining connections to ancient traditions. Approaches range from scholarly attempts at historical reconstruction to eclectic spiritual practices combining Celtic elements with other traditions. Wicca, developed by Gerald Gardner in the 1940s and 1950s, incorporated Celtic seasonal festivals and deity names into modern witchcraft tradition, claiming ancient origins. Though Gardner's historical claims lacked scholarly support, his movement's emphasis on Celtic festivals and nature worship attracted practitioners seeking alternatives to mainstream religions. The adoption of Samhain, Beltane, and other Celtic festivals by Wiccan communities helped preserve awareness of Celtic traditions while adapting them to contemporary spiritual practice. Celtic Reconstructionism emerged in the 1980s as a more historically rigorous approach to reviving Celtic religious practices. This movement emphasized careful study of primary sources, archaeological evidence, and linguistic research to create authentic reconstructions of ancient Celtic religions. Reconstructionists rejected eclectic borrowing characterizing other neo-pagan movements, instead focusing on specific Celtic cultural traditions and attempting to understand religious practices within original contexts. This scholarly approach required extensive preparation, as practitioners needed to master ancient languages, interpret archaeological evidence, and analyze mythological sources critically. Druidry experienced complex revival combining romantic imagination with historical reconstruction attempts. The ancient order of druids, founded in 1781, represented early revival effort, though its practices owed more to Freemasonry than ancient Celtic religion. Modern druid organizations like Ar Endraiocht Féin and the Order of Bards, Ovatis, and Druids developed training programs combining mythological study with practical spiritual exercises designed to recreate ancient practices. These movements emphasized environmental awareness and seasonal celebration while acknowledging limitations in historical knowledge about actual druidic practices. The influence of Celtic mythology on modern literature created new genres and narrative possibilities that continue to evolve. J.R.R. Tolkien's Middle-earth, while not explicitly Celtic, incorporated numerous Celtic mythological elements including otherworldly realms, the departure of magical beings, and connections between language and cultural identity. Tolkien's academic background in medieval literature, including Welsh and Irish sources, provided detailed knowledge that influenced his creative work. His success established fantasy literature as legitimate genre while demonstrating Celtic mythology's potential for inspiring original creation rather than mere retelling. Contemporary fantasy authors continue drawing upon Celtic mythological sources for inspiration while creating original narratives that explore contemporary themes through ancient frameworks. Authors like Patricia MacKillip, Juliet Marillier, and Morgan Llewellyn have created works that engage seriously with Celtic mythological material while addressing modern concerns about identity, environment, and spirituality. These works demonstrate mythology's continued relevance for understanding human experience while adapting ancient narratives to contemporary contexts. Celtic mythology's influence on modern fantasy literature extends far beyond simple retelling of ancient tales. to create entirely new, narrative possibilities that explore contemporary themes through mythological frameworks. J.R.R. Tolkien's academic expertise in medieval Welsh and Irish texts provided deep understanding of Celtic narrative structures, linguistic patterns, and cosmological concepts that fundamentally shaped his Middle-earth legendarium. His incorporation of Celtic elements included the concept of the West as a mystical destination where immortal beings dwelt, the fading of magical races from the mortal world, and the profound connection between language and cultural identity that characterized Celtic tradition. The success of Tolkien's work established fantasy literature as a legitimate genre capable of serious literary achievement, while demonstrating how Celtic mythology could inspire original creation rather than mere adaptation. His influence created a readership eager for fantasy drawing upon Celtic sources, encouraging publishers to support authors exploring these traditions. The establishment of fantasy as a commercial genre provided economic framework for sustained engagement with Celtic mythological material that continues generating new interpretations and adaptations. Contemporary fantasy authors have developed sophisticated approaches to Celtic source material that balance authenticity with creative innovation. Ursula K. Le Guin's Earthsea cycle, while creating an entirely original world, incorporated Celtic concepts of true names holding power, the dangerous cost of magical knowledge, and the balance between light and darkness that must be maintained rather than having one triumph over the other. Her treatment of magic as requiring precise understanding of the world as true language echoed Celtic beliefs about the power of properly spoken words while adapting these concepts to explore themes of responsibility and environmental balance. Patricia McKillip's novels demonstrate particularly sophisticated engagement with Celtic mythological themes through works that capture the otherworldly atmosphere of Celtic narratives while creating original stories. Her novel, The Book of Atrix Wolf, explores the dangerous intersection between human and fairy realms in ways that honor traditional Celtic concepts about the otherworld as beautiful but perilous nature. Her prose style, with its emphasis on imagery, ambiguity, and transformation, captures essential qualities of Celtic storytelling while serving contemporary narrative purposes. Charles de Lint's urban fantasy series, set in the fictional city of Newford, demonstrates how Celtic mythology can be transplanted to modern North American settings while maintaining essential characteristics. His works populate contemporary cities with Celtic supernatural beings adapted to urban environments, showing how ancient traditions might survive and evolve in modern contexts. His treatment of music as a gateway between worlds, the homeless as potential seers who perceive hidden realities, and artists as modern equivalents of bards who shape reality through creative expression, updates Celtic concepts for contemporary readers while preserving their essential power. The proliferation of Celtic mythology in popular culture through film, television, and digital media has introduced these traditions to global audiences while raising questions about authenticity and appropriation. Animated films like The Secret of Kells and Song of the Sea have brought Irish mythology to international attention through innovative animation techniques that capture the visual aesthetics of Celtic art. These films' success demonstrates appetite for Celtic mythological content while establishing new visual languages for representing otherworldly experiences and supernatural transformations. Television series adapting Arthurian material, from Merlin to Cursed, have reimagined Celtic-derived narratives for contemporary audiences while taking significant liberties with source material. These adaptations often emphasize action and romance over mythological authenticity, yet they maintain audience awareness of Celtic traditions and occasionally introduce viewers to lesser-known mythological elements. The tension between entertainment requirements and cultural authenticity remains an ongoing challenge for media adaptations of Celtic mythology. Video games have emerged as particularly powerful medium for engaging with Celtic mythology, allowing players to actively participate in mythological narratives rather than passively consuming them. Games like Hellblade, Senua's Sacrifice incorporate Celtic and Norse mythological elements to explore themes of mental illness and trauma through mythological frameworks. The interactive nature of gaming creates new possibilities for understanding mythology as lived experience rather than distant narrative, though it also raises concerns about trivialization of sacred traditions. Celtic music's remarkable revival has created soundtrack for renewed interest in Celtic mythology while establishing economic framework for cultural preservation. Traditional musicians have achieved international success by adapting ancient melodies and instruments for contemporary audiences. Groups like the Chieftains, Planxty and Clannad demonstrated that traditional Celtic music could attract global audiences while maintaining cultural authenticity. Their success encouraged younger musicians to explore traditional forms while creating innovative fusions with other musical genres. The relationship between Celtic music and mythology extends beyond simple accompaniment to create synthetic art forms that combine narrative, music, and performance. The tradition of Sean Nós singing preserves ancient vocal techniques that may date back to pre-Christian times, with their emphasis on ornamentation and emotional expression rather than strict melodic accuracy. Contemporary performers like Iarla o Leonard have brought these traditional techniques to new audiences while collaborating with classical and experimental musicians to create innovative contexts for ancient traditions. The development of Celtic studies as an academic discipline has created institutional support for rigorous scholarship that corrects romantic misconceptions while revealing genuine sophistication of Celtic traditions. Universities throughout Europe and North America have established Celtic studies programs that combine language instruction with cultural and historical analysis. The establishment of dedicated research centers has provided resources for scholars while creating communities of researchers who collaborate on international projects, advancing understanding of Celtic mythology and culture. Modern archaeological techniques have revolutionized understanding of Celtic religious practices and their mythological contexts. Environmental archaeology has revealed details about seasonal festivals and agricultural cycles that structured mythological narratives. Isotope analysis of human remains has demonstrated population movements that correlate with mythological accounts of invasions and migrations. Digital reconstruction of archaeological sites allows researchers to experience sacred spaces as ancient Celts might have encountered them, providing new insights into the relationship between mythology and material culture. The digitization of Celtic manuscripts has democratized access to primary sources while creating new possibilities for analysis. Projects like Irish Script on Screen have made rare manuscripts available to researchers worldwide, enabling collaborative study that would have been impossible when scholars needed to travel to specific libraries. Digital humanities techniques, including textual analysis and network visualization, have revealed patterns in mythological narratives that were difficult to detect through traditional reading methods. The application of computational linguistics to Celtic texts has enabled new forms of analysis that reveal deep structures in mythological narratives. Statistical analysis of word frequencies and collocations shows how certain concepts cluster together in ways that reveal underlying cosmological principles. Network analysis of character relationships across different texts demonstrates how mythological figures evolved through centuries of transmission. These techniques complement traditional philological methods while opening new avenues for understanding how Celtic mythology functioned as a system of meaning. The preservation of Celtic languages remains crucial for maintaining access to mythological traditions in their original forms. Language revival efforts in Ireland, Scotland, Wales and Brittany have achieved varying degrees of success in maintaining or restoring Celtic languages as living communication media. The establishment of Irish as an official European Union language has provided institutional support for language preservation, while creating economic incentives for Irish language acquisition. Welsh medium education in Wales has created new generations of Welsh speakers who can access mythological texts in their original language. The relationship between language preservation and mythological understanding extends beyond simple translation issues to encompass worldviews embedded in linguistic structures. Celtic language's verb, subject-object-word order creates different emphasis than English subject-verb-object construction, affecting how agency and action are conceptualized. The Celtic system of initial consonant mutations encoding grammatical relationships creates layers of meaning that cannot be fully translated. These linguistic features shaped how Celtic peoples understood and expressed mythological concepts in ways that translation inevitably alters. Contemporary relevance of Celtic mythology extends beyond academic study and entertainment to address broader cultural and spiritual concerns. Environmental movements have found in Celtic traditions resources for understanding human relationships with nature that contrast with industrial exploitation. The Celtic concept of thin places where the otherworld approaches the mortal realm provides framework for understanding sacred landscapes threatened by development. The emphasis on seasonal cycles and agricultural rhythms offers alternatives to linear progress narratives that justify unlimited growth. Celtic mythology's treatment of gender and sexuality provides resources for contemporary discussions about identity and social roles. The shape-shifting that pervades Celtic narratives, with beings transforming between male and female forms, suggests fluid rather than fixed gender categories. The sovereignty goddess tradition, where political authority derived from feminine divine power, offers alternatives to patriarchal power structures. The prominence of warrior women in Celtic mythology challenges assumptions about gender and violence that persist in contemporary culture. The psychological dimensions of Celtic mythology continue attracting attention from therapists and counselors who find in these narratives resources for understanding human development and healing. The hero's journey in Celtic tradition, with its emphasis on supernatural trials and tragic fate, provides alternatives to optimistic success narratives that may not resonate with people experiencing difficulty. The prominence of transformation and shape-shifting in Celtic mythology offers metaphors for psychological change that acknowledge the difficulty and disorientation of personal growth. The global Irish diaspora has created international communities that maintain connections to Celtic mythology while adapting traditions to new contexts. St. Patrick's Day celebrations worldwide have evolved from religious observance to cultural festival that often emphasizes mythological and folkloric elements over Christian content. Irish cultural centers from New York to Tokyo offer instruction in Irish language, music, and mythology, creating a global network of Celtic cultural transmission that transcends geographic boundaries. The contemporary relevance of Celtic mythology extends far beyond academic study or cultural entertainment to address fundamental questions about human relationships with nature, consciousness, and cosmic order that resonate with modern environmental and spiritual movements. The Celtic understanding of landscape as sacred, where every spring, grove, and mountain potentially house divine presence, provides alternative frameworks for conceptualizing human-environment relationships that contrast sharply with industrial paradigms of resource exploitation. This worldview, preserved through mythological narratives about divine beings inhabiting natural features, offers perspectives increasingly relevant as climate change and ecological destruction force reconsideration of humanity's relationship with the natural world. The concept of thin places, those locations where the boundary between mortal and otherworld grows permeable, has attracted particular attention from contemporary spiritual seekers who interpret these ideas through various frameworks from quantum physics to depth psychology. While these modern interpretations often diverge significantly from original Celtic concepts, they demonstrate the continuing power of Celtic cosmology to provide meaning for people seeking alternatives to purely materialist worldviews. The preservation of traditional thin places from Iona to Newgrange as pilgrimage destinations shows how mythological significance can translate into contemporary spiritual practice that transcends specific religious affiliations. Environmental movements have found in Celtic seasonal festivals models for sustainable living that integrate human activity with natural cycles rather than attempting to overcome them. The celebration of Samhain, Imbolc, Beltane and Lugnasad creates rhythm that acknowledges darkness and death as necessary components of existence rather than conditions to be conquered through technological progress. Modern practitioners who observe these festivals, whether through neo-pagan practice or secular celebration, report increased awareness of natural cycles and decreased alienation from seasonal changes that industrial society typically suppresses through climate control and artificial lighting. The Celtic emphasis on reciprocal relationships between humans and nature, where taking required giving and receiving demanded acknowledgement, provides frameworks for understanding sustainability that go beyond simple resource management. The tradition of offering first fruits, documented archaeologically through ritual deposits and textually through mythological narratives, established principles of gratitude and reciprocity that some contemporary movements seek to revive. While romantic notions of Celtic environmental harmony often oversimplify complex historical realities, the mythological emphasis on supernatural consequences for environmental transgression offers narratives that support conservation efforts. Psychological interpretations of Celtic mythology have evolved from early Jungian analyses to more sophisticated understandings that recognize cultural specificity while identifying universal patterns. The prominence of shape-shifting in Celtic narratives provides metaphors for psychological transformation that acknowledge the disorientation and loss of identity that genuine change entails. Unlike linear development models that emphasize progress toward fixed goals, Celtic transformation stories suggest that identity remains fluid and that change might involve becoming something entirely different rather than simply improved versions of current selves. The Celtic hero's relationship with fate, particularly the concept of Geas that simultaneously empowered and doomed heroes, offers frameworks for understanding how strengths and vulnerabilities interconnect. Modern therapeutic approaches that emphasize accepting rather than overcoming limitations find resonance in Celtic narratives where heroes' greatest powers often contain seeds of their destruction. This tragic sensibility, which acknowledges that excellence carries inherent danger, provides alternatives to success-oriented narratives that may not serve people facing genuine limitations or irreversible losses. The treatment of mental states in Celtic mythology, from the battle fury of warriors to the poetic inspiration of bards, suggests cultural frameworks for understanding altered consciousness that differ from pathological models. The riastrad, or warp spasm, that transformed warriors into monstrous fighters might be understood as ritualized dissociation that served specific social functions rather than simple madness. The techniques for achieving imbus, or poetic inspiration, including sensory deprivation and focused meditation, suggest systematic approaches to accessing non-ordinary consciousness that contemporary practitioners attempt to reconstruct. Gender fluidity in Celtic mythology provides resources for contemporary discussions about identity that transcend binary categories. The frequency with which mythological figures change gender, from Gwydion and Gylfaethwy's animal transformations to the sovereignty goddesses' shifts between maiden and crone, suggests cultural recognition of gender as mutable rather than fixed. While projecting modern concepts onto ancient cultures requires caution, the prominence of gender transformation in Celtic narratives demonstrates that various cultures have recognized and narratively explored gender complexity. The sovereignty goddess tradition, where political authority derived from proper relationship with feminine divine power, offers alternatives to patriarchal models of leadership. The requirement that kings maintain mystical marriage with the land's feminine spirit suggests that legitimate authority requires receptivity in relationship rather than domination. Contemporary movements seeking to reconceptualize leadership and power find in these traditions resources for imagining alternatives to hierarchical authority structures, though romanticization of Celtic gender relations ignores evidence of patriarchal elements in Celtic societies.